All right, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty controversial idea that has had some huge ripple effects in the real world. It's called standpoint theory, and it all really comes down to one big provocative question.
Can being oppressed actually give you a special insight into the way things are? And we're not just talking about social dynamics here. We're talking about everything, even science. It's a pretty wild claim, and it's right at the heart of everything we're going to explore today.
So, what exactly is standpoint theory? Let's get right into it and break down the central idea.
Okay, so at its core, standpoint theory says that oppressed groups have what's called an epistemic advantage. Now, epistemic is just a fancy word for anything related to knowledge. So the theory basically claims that their unique position in the world lets them see reality more clearly than the people in power. And again, this isn't just about social stuff. It extends to the hard sciences too.
And just to give you a sense of how far-reaching this idea is, get a load of this quote from Professor Virginia Held. She said, "A feminist standpoint would give us a quite different understanding of even physical reality." So yeah, this isn't some small tweak in perspective. It's a huge challenge to the very way we think about truth and knowledge.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because there's a flip side to this. If the oppressed have a clearer view of reality, well, it stands to reason that the most privileged people in society, what our source calls the proverbial white middle-class males, are actually in the worst position to see the truth. In this view, their privilege literally acts like a pair of blinders.
But, how does an idea this big hold up when you really start to poke at it? Well, let's turn to a major counter-argument from a leading philosopher of science, Professor Susan Hoff. She took direct aim at this whole idea of female ways of knowing.
And Hack laid out some pretty sharp criticisms. First, she just flat out says there's no such thing as a female way of knowing. How you think is individual. It's not based on your group. Second, she completely flips the theory on its head. She argues that oppression isn't an advantage at all. It's an epistemic disadvantage because it cuts people off from things like education and information. Third, she points out a kind of logical problem. Hey, if this theory were true, wouldn't the most disadvantaged groups logically produce the best scientists? And finally, she points out the irony that the very people arguing that oppression gives you special insight are not themselves oppressed. But despite these pretty powerful critiques, the theory really took off. It gained a ton of traction in universities and actually inspired a movement. The goal? Something they called transforming the knowledge base. You can see this shift really clearly in this breakdown from a university president named Yolanda Moses. On one side, you have traditional academic values, things like individual achievement and objectivity. And on the other, you have these transformationist values like cooperation, subjectivity, and putting community service ahead of faculty research. It's a fundamental change in what a university is even for.
But as this movement grew, it ran into a huge, unexpected problem. And the challenge wasn't coming from outside critics. No, it was coming from inside its own ranks. The very logic of the theory started to turn on itself.
So get this. It's 1992 at a National Women's Studies Conference. The leaders of this whole movement, who are mostly white, middle-class women, suddenly found themselves being called out for being oppressors.
What happened was a Women of Color caucus decided to boycott the whole event, but instead of just not showing up, they sent a powerful symbolic object, an African-American women's quilt. And it was meant to be, get this, both a reprimand for their exclusion and also a healing gesture. Talk about a complicated message.
So what could the leaders do? They were basically trapped. The source we're looking at says they just sat there in resentful but guilty silence. In this game of moral one-upmanship where the most oppressed person wins, they had been, and this is a great phrase from the author, out-quilted. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. A very similar situation played out a year later at a conference in Albuquerque. Participants, mostly white women, were asked to bring drums to honor Native Americans. Sounds nice, right? Well, during the conference, word got out that the actual Native American women there were offended by it. They saw it as cultural appropriation. So what happened? The organizers had to ask everyone to stop playing the drums.
So, with all these internal conflicts bubbling up, the movement's leaders realized they needed a new strategy, one that would have some pretty big consequences for the future of universities.
The new game plan was to form an alliance. They decided to place all these feminist issues under the much broader, much more popular umbrella of multiculturalism.
By joining up with popular ideas like inclusiveness and diversity, they could kind of shield themselves from the criticism that the movement was only focused on the problems of white, middle-class women.
Now, according to the source material, this strategic move did two things. One, it helped hide some of the more divisive parts of the movement from public view. And two, it diverted attention from a practical question: who was actually getting the money and the jobs that were being created in this new victim/bias industry, as the source calls it?
But what's the long-term risk of going down this road? The philosopher Iris Murdoch left us with a pretty chilling warning. She argued that when you try to create a separate sphere of female ethics or female knowledge, you don't actually get liberation. What you get, in her words, is a new female ghetto, a place that isolates women from the main currents of human thought.
And that really leaves us with a final, massive question to think about. When we start dividing up knowledge based on group identity, what do we really gain? And maybe even more importantly, what parts of our shared humanity do we risk losing forever?